Is Vladimir Putin creating a new reality on the ground in Crimea? Moscow annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2014, and Russia has since been under international sanctions. But now the Russian president has opened a direct train link to the peninsula. So what does this mean for the future? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Sahil Rahman. A new road and rail bridge now connects the Crimean peninsula with Russia. The $4 billion transport link is the longest in Europe, but it's seen by many in Kiev as a symbol of Moscow's control over the peninsula. And the United States and European Union consider it a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and have imposed sanctions on companies involved in its construction. Moscow and Kiev's relations have worsened since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. The peninsula had only been accessible from mainland Ukraine until the bridge was opened last year. Now, marked by President Vladimir Putin, he drove through it on a truck. Now, trains are starting to cross, running from St. Petersburg to Crimea's largest city, Sevastopol, and on Tuesday from Moscow to the capital, Simferopol. Russia and Ukraine have recently taken some steps to ease those tensions. They've agreed to implement a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine by the end of this year. Now, that deal was reached in Paris earlier this month when Russian and Ukrainian presidents met for the first time. Almost 2 months earlier, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky agreed elections in separatist-held parts of the Donbas region. And in September, Russia and Ukraine each exchanged 35 prisoners. Ukrainian government troops and Russian-backed separatists also withdrew from key frontline areas in eastern Ukraine over several months. Well, let's bring in our guest for this edition of Inside Story. Well, joining me from Moscow is Viktor Olivich, the lead analyst at the think tank Center for Actual Politics. Ilya Ponomarev is the CEO of Trident Acquisitions, which focuses on investment in oil and gas in Eastern Europe. He's also a former member of Russia's parliament and the only member to vote against the annexation of Crimea in 2014. He joins us from Kiev via Skype. Dara Mukdul is principal Russia analyst at the global risk consultancy Vesk Maplecroft. He joins us now from London. Gentlemen, welcome to this edition of Inside Story. Ilya Ponomarev in Kiev, can I just start with you? I mean, how significant is this in terms of a milestone in the fractious relationship between Ukraine and Russia, that this bridge has finally been built and is in operation?
Well, to my mind, it's just another step. The main symbolic act already happened when it was a car bridge opened last year. And since that time, Crimea is already linked to mainland Russia. For Putin, of course, it's extremely symbolic because this bridge became the largest infrastructure project in the country. And unfortunately, that is done at the expense of Russian taxpayers. For example, where I'm coming from Novosibirsk, in my constituency, they canceled the construction of the bridge across Ob River to finance the construction of the bridge across Kerch Strait, this one to Crimea, and as well as in other region of Russia, in Yakutia, they canceled another railway bridge across Lena River. So basically, what has been done right now, it's public relations for Mr. Putin to support his popularity and to show that Crimea is Russian. Of course, people in Ukraine are angered about this. My personal take on this, that at the end of the day, annexation of Crimea is temporary and the occupation is temporary. At the end of the day, Crimea would go back to Ukraine. And in this case, Ukraine would inherit this piece of infrastructure, and that would help Crimeans.
Ilya, sorry to interrupt. You're going to have got a lot to think about there, and a lot to comment on as well through this programme. Viktor Olivich, you heard what Ilya had to say. I mean, from the Russian perspective, this is yet another, you might say, infrastructure success for the president. But in recent weeks, in a sort of State of the Union, the end-of-year address, he did talk about the fact, didn't he, in his address to the Russian people, that there were problems with the economy, there were problems with corruption. And so I wonder how Russian people would actually take the opening of this bridge. I mean, do they see it as something that they can take pride in, or is it just an unnecessary expense?
Well, of course, Crimea has a long history both with Russia and Ukraine. For hundreds of years, Russia and Ukraine were part of the same state, including the Soviet times when Crimea was formally transferred from the Russian Federation to the Ukrainian Republic at that time by Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s. And of course, the vast majority of the population in Crimea is Russian, ethnically Russian, and they are Russian speakers. But the main reason why the Russian leadership decided in 2014 to take Crimea was geopolitical, because the Russian leadership, the Kremlin at that time, believed that if Crimea remained a part of Ukraine after the change of power, after Yanukovych was ousted in Kiev, then the Kremlin believed that the Russian Black Sea Fleet that was based in Ukraine would no longer be able to function, would need to be moved to different bases, and Russia did not at that time even have bases which could house the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and the Kremlin was also concerned, afraid that the
Victor,
Americans
I have to interrupt
some
you.
other
I'm sorry, Victor.
foreign,
Victor, with respect, sir, I have to. Victor,
but back to your question.
Yeah, with respect, I have to interrupt you. We don't need a history lesson. We need, because we know the history of the region with respect. So the question again is, how would the public react to this in relation to, obviously, the history of what's gone on in the peninsula in the last couple of years?
Well, the public mostly sees it as a necessary expense. Yes, the economic situation is quite bleak, and it's not expected to get better in the next months and years. But for the people that live in Crimea, and for the people that seek to travel there, of course, these new infrastructure projects look necessary. Crimea is being blocked, isolated by Ukraine as a territory that is no longer under its sovereignty, and so Moscow is attempting to lay new groundwork, new ways to get into Crimea, to connect it to the Russian mainland, and this bridge, both as far as car traffic and train traffic is concerned, is part of those efforts.
Indeed. Dara McDowell, can I just bring you in here? I mean, you've heard sort of the two sides of this from our guests in Moscow and Kiev. I mean, how much of this project is actually symbolic? How much of it is actually a political or military need or an economic need for Russia at this moment in time?
Well, it's all three of those things at once. For the start, we should distinguish the fact that contrary to Ilya, we would expect that the occupation of Crimea at this point is going to remain relatively permanent, absent any sort of massive political change in Russia. Krim nash, Crimea is ours, was a major booster for Putin back in 2014. That's worn off at this point. But at this point, even if the rest of the world is never going to recognize the annexation, there's very little prospect of Russia going out. So these infrastructure projects are necessary to support the peninsula, to provide direct links. We'll also need to see things with electricity, fresh water to reduce its dependence on Ukraine. But they also provide an economic benefit for certain people allied towards the Kremlin. The people who get these contracts, the people who are trusted to carry them out, this is a very lucrative business for all of them. Now, what this actually means for ordinary Russians at this point is harder to see. Since 2014, we've seen the oil price collapse. We've seen a deep recession followed by several years of economic stagnation and falling living standards throughout the regions in particular, which has led to an increase in protest activity, not just political protests in Moscow, but protests across places like Arkhangelsk and Voronezh, all against certain aspects of the state's policies, whether that be plans for garbage dumps, whether that be local infrastructure, ordinary Russians are very annoyed. And they're annoyed with the power structures, even if they're not articulating that right now. So while this bridge to Crimea isn't going to get people out in the streets as to why are we wasting money on this, I think Mikhail is right that there's a Krimnash, the Crimean consensus, is accepted in Russia, but it's not something that people are going to be celebrating with fireworks and fanfare.
Well, Ilya Ponomarev in Kiev, you were nodding your head. You want to come in on those comments, I think.
Yeah, I think that in terms of Russians, ordinary Russians' take on this, I think they wouldn't notice this too much because they don't see the connection where the budgetary flows are coming. But for people in Crimea, from one side, of course, it's a sign that Russia is not forgetting them, and currently there are second ideas on this among ordinary Crimeans. But the most important thing that Crimea is struggling without fresh water, and it's right now struggling on the verge of ecological disaster. And Moscow is still investing in the bridge, which has been constructed by Putin's closest associates, Rotenberg family, which are directly benefiting from that financially. But instead, they are not doing nothing to support Crimeans in terms of internal Crimean infrastructure, like water supplies, as I said. And that's what all people in Crimea feels every day.
Viktor Olovich in Moscow, in terms of the way Russia has proceeded to build a bridge and to solidify its links with Crimea, is that more in reaction as well to the isolation it's felt from the international community since sanctions were put in place, either by the EU or by the US?
Well, of course, Russia has felt the bite of these sanctions, and not just by the West, by the EU and the US, but Russia has been forced to adapt to a new economic reality where the Ukrainian industrial enterprises that were part of the Russian, that serviced the Russian military industry, defense industry, Russia has now essentially been forced to provide, to make its own defense enterprises take over from the Ukrainian ones that they dealt with before 2014. Russia has also had to build new railway lines around Ukraine. Russia has also been basically felt it necessary to build this bridge to Crimea to connect the peninsula to the Russian mainland. So Russia has definitely had to increase its expenditures in a new economic and a new geopolitical reality. And this is certainly a long-term situation. The Kremlin understands that. And of course, I would also agree with my colleague in London that the so-called Crimea is ours effect, and it was a euphoric moment in 2014 when Crimea became part of Russia. It was a euphoric moment for many Russian citizens, and it was something that sort of nullified for several years up until now the massive protest activity that Russia saw in 2010-2011 electoral cycle. And now, as this effect is wearing off, we are seeing indeed new protest activity, not just in Moscow, but in other parts of the country. And we can expect that people are going to manifest their desires and their dislike of the problems that they see in their life even more steadfastly because the Crimea effect is wearing off indeed.
Indeed. Dara McDowell, can I just come back to you before we go back to Ilya in Kiev? Because I wondered, what do you think would be the next move now by the EU and the US now that this bridge is in operation? The road side of the bridge was operational, last year? And now the train side has become operational. How much of it is it going to irk the EU and the US into any moves? Will they want to?
At this point, we wouldn't expect anything beyond some strongly worded letters and expressions of concerns. Number one, this is all just reflecting facts on the ground. As you said, the CART bridge is already open. This is just opening up the rail network. Secondly, we have to consider the fact that the transatlantic relationship is very, very different than what it was in 2014. We have a US president whose approach to foreign policy, should we say, is atypical of a lot of his predecessors, who hasn't shown a lot of enthusiasm for working together with the European Union, certainly not for coordinating big actions against Russia. And so the question is, first off, what can you do at this point that actually imposes material costs on the Russian Federation without massively escalating the situation above and beyond what it is right now? And how do you get to that solution and coordinate and agree it between both Washington and all the European states? And keep in mind that France is looking for some way to reach a détente. The UK is leaving the EU, and its role in the foreign policy making of the bloc is going to be up in the air. So there's a whole lot of frayed connections at the moment, and the mechanisms by which these things would usually be coordinated and implemented are just not functioning as they would be. And even more importantly, there isn't the political will at the top, particularly in Washington.
And of course, as you say, frayed connections, but it's also quite a story of moving parts, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. Ilya Ponomarev in Kiev, of course, one way that Kiev has reacted is to get closer to the EU in various forms and on various agreements. Militarily, it does want to get closer. It's even eyeing up potential membership of NATO. That worries Russia. Potential membership of the EU. That worries Russia. Which direction do you think Kiev is going to go in then with regard to, if they can't find a solution with Russia, they'll find a better partnership with Europe and other allies?
I think that there are two angles of the situation. The Crimean angle, most likely it would be a frozen conflict, a frozen occupation, like it was with the occupation of the Baltic states under Soviet Union's realm for 40 more years. And that didn't prevent the West to work with the Soviet Union, have relations with the Soviet Union, economic ties with the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union began to collapse, they regained their independence, and that was immediately acknowledged, and those states were introduced to the European Union and NATO and stuff. And I think that with the Crimea, it would be more or less the same situation. So nobody would say that it's Russian territory, but everybody would pretend to forget about it for a while.
Okay.
The second angle, which is way more important at the moment, is the angle of the war in eastern Ukraine, where people are dying every single day. And that's where the focus is right now. That's where the focus from European Union is, the focus from United States is, and the focus of Ukrainians is. And I think that that's where we need to find an immediate solution. And in the meanwhile, while Crimea is occupied, is to rebuild the Ukrainian economy and show to ordinary Crimeans that if they would have been with Ukraine, their life would be significantly better than it is right now with Russia.
Indeed, that's a debate yet again for another day with people from Crimea. Victor Olevich in Moscow. I mean, you heard our guest there, Ilya in Kiev, and of course there is obviously two sides to this. And of course, from Russia's point of view, as they see Ukraine getting closer to the EU, or certainly more friendly, Russia has been thrown out of the G8. It's had its diplomats removed, for example, from the United Kingdom after the poisoning and the accusation that they were behind the poisoning of a former Russian agent, Sergei Skripal. I mean, this sort of schism between Russia's relations with Europe is something that doesn't sit well with Moscow. They would like to be friendly, but they can't because of the dynamics of their internal politics, especially when it comes to Crimea. Would Vladimir Putin like to be back in the G8? Would he like to have better relations with the EU? Or is he actually quite happy with the way things are right now?
Well, the Kremlin would like to have a better relationship with the European Union, a much better relationship with Europe. In fact, if you look back at Putin's first years in office, he had tried to manage a strategic relationship or strategic partnership with Germany under Gerhard Schröder at that time. He had tried to improve relations with the UK, which have almost for decades been very difficult for Moscow. He had tried to manage a relationship with Jacques Chirac, at that time the president of France, and with other European leaders. And of course, as years passed by, first with the conflict in Georgia in 2008, and then much more significantly with the change of power in Ukraine in 2014 and the Russian response to it, of course, the relationship with Europe has frayed. Moscow has taken a stance whereby it would like to have a better relationship with Brussels and with the European capitals, but the European capitals are essentially not responding to that, and Moscow is not willing to make those steps or those concessions that would be needed in the eyes of the European leaders to improve that relationship. So at this point, the Russian leadership is quite pessimistic. It would like to improve that relationship, but it's pessimistic about the chances, the real chances of improving the relationship with Europe. At the same time, it is pursuing attempts to improve or at least normalize, stabilize relations with specific European states, such as Italy, Austria, Hungary, and some others that may be more attuned to a more normalized, stable relationship with Russia, with less criticism of its domestic or foreign policy. So we should not at this point expect a significant change either from Moscow, on Moscow's side, or from the side of or from the European side, and the relationship is expected to be as bleak as it is right now, perhaps even worse.
We are coming to near the end of our programme. Dara McDowell, can I just bring you in there about that relationship? I mean, at the moment it's pessimistic on the political front. Yeah, it's funny how strong, you might say, the euro, the pound, the dollar or the ruble speaks when it comes to building an underwater pipeline from Russia to Europe. They're willing to talk on that level, are they not, when it comes to the economy and to, you might say, keeping Europe warm?
Well, I mean, Nord Stream 2 is, as far as Germany is concerned, an economic project. When it comes online, even given the fact that Ukraine is obviously quite upset about this because of the potential for its pipeline capacity being bypassed, European import demand is going to be such for the foreseeable future that there will be, even NS2 won't be able to supply at all, and Ukraine will still need to be used. That's kind of a long-term structural interdependence between the two countries. And while I'd agree with Victor that it's very unlikely that we're going to see a rapprochement between Europe and Russia, we shouldn't put it down to political willpower between either two sides. We've seen Macron make some very forward-looking statements in terms of rapprochement. It comes down to incompatibility and basic principles of statecraft from the two sides. Europe has certain expectations about the rights of sovereign states, even those in Russia's neighborhood, and their ability to choose their own policy. It has certain standards on human rights and the independence of courts. And even as we saw this early Putin rapprochement with Europe, largely or in part because of Iraq and because the Western allies were distant from the U.S., we were still seeing things like the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko, a certain free ride for Russian organized crime and intelligence activities in Europe. And even as you've talked about building relations with Austria, Hungary, and Italy, we've seen Russia intervening in Europe to support far right and in some cases far left populist or anti-system parties. So it's not so much that Russia, is looking for Europe to re-engage. It's that Russia really would like to see Europe change fundamentally before it feels it can safely engage, and to agree vice versa.
Well, we certainly have to leave it with that sort of pause for thought for the moment. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but it's been a great pleasure speaking to all three of you. Viktor Olevich in Moscow, Ilya Ponomarev in Kiev and Dara McDougall in London. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. And of course, you can continue to watch this programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sahil Rahman, and the whole Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.